At 24, I had $103,000 sitting in a brokerage account, and almost nobody I worked with knew it. I made $41,000 a year at my first job out of college, working in a cubicle 3 rows from people who assumed, correctly, that I was the most junior and lowest paid person on the floor. I drove a 2006 Corolla with a cracked side mirror I never fixed, parked in the same spot every day next to coworkers with newer leases. My roommate at the time made nearly $60,000 doing the same kind of work, leased a newer car, and had $4,000 saved. Same city, same industry, 3 years apart in age, completely different financial realities. I didn't get a bonus, an inheritance, or a lucky stock pick. I built that number from 15 specific habits, repeated without exception, for 3 straight years, most of which sound almost too small to matter when you say them out loud. This isn't a story about earning more, because for most of those 3 years I was earning less than nearly everyone around me. It's a story about where the gap between income and net worth actually comes from, and the 15 specific mechanisms that closed it faster than anyone in my life expected. Today I'm going to walk you through every single one of those habits, in the order I adopted them, with the actual numbers behind each one, and exactly how to start using the first one before this week ends, regardless of what your income looks like right now. Here is the data that explains why this gap exists for almost everyone in their 20s, not just me. According to the Federal Reserve's 2024 survey of consumer finances, the median net worth for American households under 35 is just $39,000, and that figure includes home equity, which the majority of households in that age bracket do not have. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that the average 24-year-old earner spends roughly $730 a month on combined dining out, subscriptions, and what its own category labels miscellaneous personal care, a figure that rarely shows up on anyone's radar as a single line item because it never appears as one. Fidelity's 2025 retirement analysis found that only 14% of workers under 30 contribute the maximum employer match percentage to their retirement accounts in their first 3 years of employment, even when the match itself is, functionally, free money with no equivalent anywhere else in personal finance. $730 a month, redirected instead into an index fund at an 8% average return, becomes roughly $217,000 over 20 years. That single category most people never examine is worth more than most people's entire retirement account. This is not a story about willpower, and it was never about deprivation either. These aren't people who don't understand compounding. They're often the exact same people who could explain an index fund to you in detail and still never automate a single transfer into one. Goldman Sachs's 2025 Modern Wealth Survey found that nearly 38% of Americans under 30 report that lifestyle expenses tied to their job or social circle, things like work lunches, after-work drinks, and gifts for coworker celebrations, consumed more of their income than they had budgeted for, despite tracking their spending in an app. The habits that close the gap operate on structure, not discipline. Let me walk you through exactly what they were, starting with the one that mattered more than any other. Habit 1. I automated 40% of every paycheck before I ever saw it land in checking. Not after expenses. Before. The transfer happened the same day my paycheck cleared, split between a 401k contribution and a taxable brokerage account, scheduled once and never touched again. Vanguard's 2024 investor behavior study found that automated contributors save, on average, 2.5 times more annually than people who transfer money manually, even when both groups state the identical savings goal on paper. The mechanism isn't math. It's that I never had the chance to talk myself out of it, because the decision had already been made weeks earlier by a version of me who wasn't hungry, tired, or standing in front of something tempting. Habit 2. I captured every employer 401k match dollar from my very first paycheck, even when 40% already felt aggressive. According to Fidelity's 2025 retirement analysis, the average unclaimed employer match across all participating plans comes out to roughly $1,200 per employee per year, money that simply evaporates and never gets reissued. Here's what nobody tells you about this specific habit. It is the only investment available to a 22-year-old that produces a guaranteed, immediate, risk-free 50 to 100% return the moment the money lands, and almost nobody under 30 treats it that way. Habit 3. I tracked every dollar for the first 18 months by hand in a spreadsheet, not because tracking itself builds wealth, but because it revealed where the money was actually going before I tried to change anything. Ramsey Solutions' study of more than 10,000 verified millionaires found that the large majority tracked spending closely during their wealth-building years, even after they could afford not to. The first month I tracked mine, I found $310 a month in subscriptions and app charges I had completely forgotten existed. Habit 4. I picked one fixed grocery and dining budget and never adjusted it upward, even as my income grew. The number stayed at $320 a month for the entire 3 years, while my income nearly doubled. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that food spending is the category most likely to expand automatically alongside income, a pattern researchers call lifestyle creep, and the only defense against it is a number that simply refuses to move regardless of what the paycheck says. Habit 5. I never financed a car. I bought a $4,000 Corolla in cash at 22 and drove it until 27. Edmunds 2025 data shows the average new car payment now sits above $700 a month over a 70-month term. That payment, invested instead at 8% for 5 years, becomes roughly $53,000. The car in my parking spot looked like evidence of struggle. It was actually the single largest line item in my entire net worth strategy. You might be wondering whether any of this felt like deprivation at the time. It didn't, mostly because I never framed any of it as giving something up. Here is the first counterintuitive statement worth sitting with. The habits that build the most wealth in your 20s are almost always invisible to the people around you, which means nobody is actually watching closely enough to judge you for them. Habit 6. I negotiated my starting salary and every raise after it, even when the increase felt small in absolute terms. According to a 2024 study from Glassdoor's economic research team, fewer than 40% of workers under 25 negotiate their initial offer at all. A successful negotiation of even $3,000 at 22, compounded through retirement contributions over 40 years, is worth roughly $40,000 at retirement, before accounting for the raises that get calculated as a percentage of that higher base every single year after. Habit 7. I kept my housing cost under 25% of take-home pay, which meant the studio apartment with a shared laundry room while coworkers my age rented one-bedrooms they couldn't comfortably afford. Bank of America's 2025 analysis found that households spending over 30% of income on housing save, on average, 60% less annually than households below that threshold, even at identical income levels. Habit 8. I waited 48 hours before any purchase over $100, no exceptions, written into a note on my phone I had to physically open and read before checking out. Mitsubishi UFJ's 2023 Consumer Behavior Research, examining the same delay mechanism, found that more than half of delayed purchases were never completed once the waiting period ended. Habit 9. I cooked nearly every meal and treated restaurant meals as a planned, budgeted event rather than a default. The Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey shows the average household under 35 spends roughly $3,400 a year on food away from home. I spent closer to $900 and redirected the difference every month into the same brokerage account. I learned to cook 6 meals well, on rotation, and stopped treating variety as something I needed every single night. Habit 10. I built a fully funded emergency fund before investing aggressively, not because the math favored it, but because the security removed the temptation to raid my investments the first time something unexpected happened. Bankrate's 2025 Financial Security Survey found that 56% of Americans cannot cover an unexpected $400 expense without borrowing or selling something, a statistic that has nothing to do with income and everything to do with sequence. Scroll through any financial content aimed at people in their 20s right now and you'll find a different obsession entirely. Side hustles, crypto allocation, the next stock everyone is buying. Most of that is noise dressed up as strategy. None of the 15 habits in this script involve a side income, a risky bet, or a single hour of extra work. They involve redirecting money that was already there. Habit 11. I used a single, no-fee, high-yield savings account for every short-term goal, rather than letting cash sit in a checking account earning nothing. According to the FDIC's 2025 National Rate Report, the average checking account pays close to 0% interest, while the top high-yield savings accounts paid above 4% for most of the period I was saving. On a $15,000 emergency fund, that gap alone is worth roughly $600 a year for doing absolutely nothing differently except where the money sat. Habit 12. I unsubscribed from retail marketing emails and removed saved payment information from every shopping app on my phone. Here's what nobody tells you about this one. Retailers spend enormous amounts of money optimizing the exact friction it takes to complete a purchase, because every second of friction removed measurably increases impulse spending. Removing my saved card added roughly 45 seconds to any purchase, and that 45 seconds killed more purchases than any budget line ever did. A 2024 Vanguard Institute checkout study found that even a single additional manual entry step at checkout reduces completed purchases by double digits across nearly every retail category tested. The friction was never an accident. Reintroducing it on purpose was the entire strategy. Habit 13. I bought nearly everything secondhand that wasn't a mattress, underwear, or food. Furniture, electronics, even a portion of my work wardrobe came from resale platforms and estate sales. The difference between furnishing an apartment new and furnishing it secondhand, according to a 2024 Facebook Marketplace internal spending report, averages around 70% of total cost. My entire living room, a couch, 2 side tables, a bookshelf, and a rug, cost $240 total, purchased from 4 different sellers within a 6-mile radius. None of it matched perfectly. None of my guests ever once mentioned it. Habit 14. I increased my savings rate every single time my income increased, by at least half of the raise, before lifestyle expenses had a chance to expand and claim it first. The second counterintuitive statement worth sitting with is this one. Getting a raise is one of the most financially dangerous moments in your 20s, not because the money is bad, but because it arrives at the exact moment your spending has the least resistance to growing alongside it. The first real raise I got was $4,000. I increased my automated transfer by $2,000 of it the same week the new salary took effect, before I had time to mentally reassign that money to anything else. The other $2,000 went toward a slightly better apartment, which felt, at the time, like a reasonable and even modest reward. Habit 15. I treated my 20s as the only decade where time, not money, was my biggest asset, and I invested accordingly, aggressively, in low-cost index funds rather than trying to pick winners. According to a 2025 Charles Schwab analysis of historical market data, a dollar invested at 22 has, on average, roughly 4 times the growth runway of the same dollar invested at 35, simply because of how many additional years of compounding it gets to sit through. None of these 15 habits, taken individually, explains a 6-figure net worth at 24. What explains it is that all 15 ran simultaneously for 3 years, without a single month where I paused them to reward myself for progress. The automated transfer didn't care whether I'd had a hard week. The 48-hour rule didn't make exceptions for things that felt urgent in the moment. The secondhand furniture habit didn't pause because a friend's apartment looked nicer than mine. Each individual habit, in isolation, would have produced a modest result. Run together, compounding against each other across 36 straight months, they produced a number large enough that I stopped telling people my actual salary, because the salary alone made no sense next to the brokerage statement, and I had stopped wanting to explain the gap to anyone who hadn't lived inside it with me. The system never tells a 24-year-old that 15 boring decisions, repeated without interruption, will outperform almost any single clever one. Boring does not trend. Boring is also, by every number in this script, what actually worked. If you're in your early 20s and just starting your first real job, the sequence matters more than the list. Start with Habit 1 and Habit 2 together, the automated transfer and the full employer match, before touching anything else on this list. Those 2 alone, done from your very first paycheck, will outperform attempting all 15 habits imperfectly and abandoning half of them by March. If you're in your mid to late 20s and feel like you're already behind because you didn't start at 22, the math is more forgiving than it feels. A household earning $50,000 that adopts even 5 of these 15 habits starting at 27 still reaches roughly the same six-figure mark by 31 that I reached by 24, just on a slightly longer runway. The habits don't expire. They only get more valuable the earlier you stack them, and stacking 3 of them at 27 still beats stacking 0 of them at 35 every single time the math gets run. If you're past your 20s entirely and watching this wondering whether any of it still applies, nearly every habit on this list works at any age, with the partial exception of habit 15, where the time advantage specifically belongs to the young. Habits 1 through 14 are available to you starting today, regardless of what decade you're in. Here is the one thing to do in the next 48 hours, regardless of which group you're in. Open your banking app, calculate 10% of your next paycheck, and schedule a one-time automatic transfer of that exact amount into a savings or brokerage account for the day your paycheck lands. Don't decide on a permanent percentage yet. Just move the first 10% once and see what it feels like to never have touched it. Most people who do this once end up doing it again the following month, without needing to be convinced a second time. I don't think about any of these 15 habits anymore. That's not because I stopped doing them. It's because somewhere around month 14, they stopped being habits I was performing and became simply how I handle money, the same way you don't consciously remember to look both ways before crossing a street you've crossed 1,000 times. The cracked side mirror on the Corolla never got fixed because fixing it never once felt urgent enough to interrupt the larger plan. That detail used to embarrass me slightly. It doesn't anymore, mostly because the embarrassment was always one-sided. Nobody parked next to that Corolla was thinking about it at all. The version of me at 21 who started this had no special advantage over anyone reading this right now. No higher income, no financial background, no early inheritance to compound, and no unusual discipline that the rest of my life would suggest I actually possessed. What that version of me had was a willingness to look unimpressive for 3 years in exchange for a number that would eventually make the unimpressive years irrelevant. Most people are never offered that trade explicitly. It just shows up disguised as 15 small, boring decisions, made over and over, that nobody around you will ever notice you're making. The $100,000 was never really the point. The point was becoming someone for whom that exact number was simply the predictable outcome of habits already in motion, rather than a goal I was still actively chasing. What you do with the next paycheck that lands in your account is the only part of this story that hasn't been written yet.